I'm going to try and recreate a vintage look that will either end up a cute early 1960s top, or it'll look like I'm an extra in a 1980s teen sitcom. I recently fell in love with a vintage pattern that I saw on Pinterest, McCalls 5831 from 1961. Particularly that 3-color top. Immediately I was like, oh, I want to make this exactly like this right now. Plus, I've been wanting to try color blocking for a while, so everything else just took a backseat to this. And here is the fabric that I ordered. It was really hard to find fabric that was right for a shirt that was in similar colors because I wanted to recreate the original look. So this is a poly cotton blend broadcloth. I didn't really want to invest too much money into this because I don't really know if I'm going to like it. Conceptually, I love it, but... So, $3 yard fabric it is. I will say the pink is hilariously bright. Neon was in the name of the color, but also it was called Neon Fuchsia, and it's more coral than fuchsia, so I ignored the neon part, but they meant it. So this may end up being 1960s by way of the 1980s, but I don't hate it. I really do like these colors, and I like neon. So even though I bought a backup color, I'm going to stick with these ones. Here's the thing though, I don't actually have McCalls 5831. But I do have Advanced 9030, which is a late 1950s pattern with a similar shape. So my plan is to take the Advanced pattern and modify the neckline and hack it up to color block it and recreate the look of the McCalls pattern. Sounds easy, right? We'll see. Oops, excuse me. Who am I saying excuse me to? So I've identified some initial things I need to do before I can plan the color blocking part. I need to trace the bodice of view 1 of the Advanced pattern, and I need to change it to a plain neckline instead of the one with a cutout for this bound edge, although that's really cute, so I definitely want to do that someday. And then I'll need to make my own front and back neckline facing pieces. And then before I can get to my seam lines for the color blocking, I need to actually shorten the darts. This is view 2 that I sewed for my all-in-one facing burrito method tutorial, and even though I've made 2 of these in the past and wear them every summer, I never noticed until now that the bust dart extends all the way to the high point of my bust, so I'd like them about an inch shorter. So I'll transfer that change to my pattern piece. And then I'll be ready to hack up the bodice for color blocking. Turns out there's some interesting things to sort out while I'm tracing. First, I looked at the cut-on sleeve length. Even though this is more of a short sleeve, cut-on sleeve, rather than a shorter cap sleeve, I just made the Charm Patterns Hepburn tops, and you can watch my video on that. And that has a cut-on sleeve. And at a glance, I already thought, I think this is a little bit longer than what I'd like. So this is the Hepburn pattern piece here, and I just compared the two. This is the short sleeve hemline that I decided that I liked, and this is the hemline of the Advanced pattern. So I'll probably shorten these sleeves just a little bit. It's also a very roomy looking sleeve compared to the pattern envelope, so I'll probably raise this about an inch. Editor Tasha here to tell you, I will live to regret that decision. I also noticed something interesting, which, I don't know, if you like vintage sewing patterns, you may find this interesting too. This pattern calls for a turned hem on the cut-on sleeve, with about an inch turned back. I just found that interesting because I sew a lot of cut-on sleeves, and most commonly for a short sleeve, probably in the 50s and 60s, at least the patterns I'm most familiar with, it would be finished with bias tape as a facing, maybe sometimes an actual facing piece. So it's kind of unusual for it to be a turned hem though. But I'll be using bias tape because I won't have enough room to turn this back anyway after I shorten the sleeve length a little bit. I already know I need to shorten the bust darts a bit, but interestingly, I discovered that view 2 and view 1 don't actually have the same darts, which I would have expected. So I'll lower the view 1 dart the same amount that I lowered the view 2 dart, even though they're slightly different shaped darts. Then I just need to decide on the hem length because the hem turn up for view 2 that I've made is much deeper, but I like that as a finished length on me, so I'll need to make a judgment call on how deep I'd like the hem to be for this view 1, and I think it means I'll need to extend it a little bit on this pattern piece. And I will do all of this with the pattern piece on the fold just like this, but then I'll need to trace a second version of the whole pattern because only then will I truly be ready to hack up the bodice for color blocking. Finally! Okay, I have my bodice cut out, and here is where we're at next. I need to decide how I'm going to finish the seam allowances between each of these colors. Now, the McCalls pattern, from what I could figure out, the green thin strip is actually an applied strip right on top. So there's really only one seam in the front bodice between the orange and the pink, and the green is applied, I assume, probably top stitched on top. So that is one option. And then the other option that I thought about is I could just do each as a separate strip on the bodice and do a French seam between each of them. The green one is going to be a skinny little one, so I don't know if that's going to look really weird. I don't know how much you're going to see of these seam allowances once this is against my body, because the fabric is kind of sheer, so just holding it to the light, I can see it pretty well, but once I put my hand underneath it, I can't. So I'm going to sew up a little sample of each of these ideas and see if I can decide which I like better. And my two little samples are done, the one with the French seams and the one with the green band applied. And I also pressed this up just to test and see how these fabrics would work together pressed up at the hemline, because this is the one that both my spouse and I liked better, just for no other reason than aesthetically. We kind of liked the way it looked a little bit better. So I'm going to go with the original method of applying the green band on top. I have yet to decide if I am going to color block the back. I can tell from the envelope art that the back was plain, and I'm just not sure what I think yet. Maybe I will see how annoying it is to apply this in a very, very straight line on the front and see if I feel like doing that on the back or if I just feel like making the back plain. So we will figure that out when we get there. So right now what I need to do is decide where I'm going to make the seam that the green will be applied on top of. And from that I can tell it should be, I think, right about here. I did do a little kind of math. This is obviously not a real person, it's a drawing, but I did kind of math out what I thought would be the actual width of this green band if this person were my size. And I came to the determination that that would be approximately 1.5 inches, which is the width I did on my little sample here. So that is what I'm going to go with. I'm going to go with 1.5 inches finished width. So I'm going to cut this up and add the seam allowances, and I can finally get started. So really, all I needed to do was slash the pattern along where I wanted the seam line and add a seam allowance on both pieces. I also trimmed the seam allowances at the neckline edge. I marked where I thought I needed to cut off, but just to be on the safe side, I folded the pattern piece on the seam line and cut it off that way. And it's a new day. I've got a new manicure. Let's cut some fabric. Aw, I sounded so hopeful, didn't I? Why did I think cutting was going to go smoothly? I cut out the left front in my pink fabric, but when I laid out my orange fabric, I realized that there were some marks on it I hadn't noticed or somehow got on it in the laundry. I don't know, they almost look like grease stains. So I cut the right front around that, only to realize, wait a minute, there's also a couple of black spots on the piece that I cut out, and that just derailed me. I tried to get the black spots out of the piece I'd cut out, which didn't work, and I had to come back the next day to just reassess. I marked all the grease stains with pins to try and figure out what I could cut around, because I still hadn't decided if I wanted a solid orange back or a color blocked back, so I was hoping I had enough room for a full solid back in case I wanted to do that. And thankfully I had enough, so I cut out my orange front and then my green strip and moved on to picking thread, which I should have done before I started. Okay, so things are very chaotic with this project, and I haven't even started sewing yet. But I just keep running into one small hurdle after another small hurdle after another small hurdle. First it was the weird, mysterious grease stains on the orange fabric, and then the black dots on the orange fabric, so I had to cut out my right front piece again. And then when I did that, I noticed there were the same kind of grease stains on the green fabric, even though there aren't any on the pink fabric, and I washed the three of them together. I don't think I put anything else in that load, maybe like a towel or something, but nothing that would transfer grease onto it, and I'm pretty sure that wasn't on the fabric when I bought it. So at least I only have to do one, possibly two, depending on if I do it for the back, skinny strip of the green, but I was kind of hoping to use the rest of the fabric for another version, flip-flopping the colors someday. Maybe I'll still be able to do that. Who knows? Maybe the grease will come off in the laundry. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just soap. Maybe the laundry didn't rinse. No idea. So those fabric shenanigans aside, after I got my 2 front pieces and my little green strip cut out, I sat down to thread my sewing machine with pink thread and realized, there's the spool. I don't have enough of it. So that color is out the window, and I have lots of other pinks and none of them really match at all. I have a sort of strange orangey rust. I don't really know what I'd call this color. I have this color and it kind of splits the difference between the pink and the orange. And the only reason I care that much is because the pink is the most sheer of all. So I don't really want a dark color showing through. So I've been staring at thread colors for a while. The good news is the only color that you'll actually see from the outside is the top stitching on the green, and I have a great green thread that matches this. So huzzah, at least I've got one thing sorted out. But then when I started thinking about how the pink was a little bit sheer, I started to wonder, what thread color am I going to use on the bias tape or on the armhole to hand slip stitch that? So I did a little test in a couple of colors of pink to see what was the least obvious from the right side. And I think if I'm just really, really careful at truly only picking one thread at a time when I slip stitch that I will be okay with this totally not matching pink thread. And you know, it's one seam and one applied strip of another color. You would think I wouldn't have to think this hard about thread colors and seam finishes, because I've also been trying to think through, does it make sense to have pink thread in my serger? Yeah, probably, because the pink is the most sheer. I have spent way too long thinking about all of this. I have done this to myself. I've dug my hole and I am sitting in it, unable to move past. And I hate when I do this to myself for projects, but I have done that on this one. So I'm frustrated enough that I would almost walk away from this, but I'm not going to, because I really want the final blouse in the end. So I think if I just kind of push through the state of mind that I am in right now, that things will be okay. And truly, all of these things are things that would make me just kind of bail on this project and just say, forget it, it was cheap fabric, throw it in the bin, don't worry about it. But I'm not going to do that, and you know, I don't want to waste fabric either. And I want to do a video for you. And I want this freaking blouse. So I'm going to keep at it. I'm going to keep at it. This is me trying to smile nicely. Okay, I'm going to keep at it. Do I look convincing? I don't know. Have I convinced myself? Oh, God. Save me from myself, please. I know. I was overthinking some of this thread stuff way more than I needed to and letting myself get frustrated. So I resolved the next day I'd sit down and just start. So I used light pink for the dart and stay stitching on the neckline of the pink front piece, and my weird orangey, rusty, whatever color for the dart and stay stitching on the orange front piece. And then I could finally sew the pink and orange front seam. And also, to prep the green strip to apply to the front, I decided to baste just inside of a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I could press along the basting to make sure I got a really crisp, perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm finally at the point where I can apply my green strip. Yay! So I have a narrow seam allowance pressed under on both sides. This is 1.5 inches finished width, and I added another 1/2 inch for a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides. Now I marked a notch at the top and the bottom on both sides 3/4 inch away from the seam line, since 3/4 times 2 is 1.5 inches for my finished width. Meaning that the outer edges of my strip should meet up with those notches when I lay it down the seam line. But I don't really trust that I can line up everything exactly at the top and the bottom and be good for the whole length. Obviously, I have to trim off some off the top of the green strip. So what I'm planning to do is actually mark just inside that 3/4 inch line all the way down on both sides. And then when I'm pinning the strip on, I can just use those as guidelines the whole way. I could use temporary fabric glue or hand basting. I think I'm going to see if pinning is enough, because at this point in this project, the way this is going, this is absolutely a decision I would just debate in my head forever. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go for it. Whatever it is, that is what I'm going for. And this was actually not as difficult as I expected. I marked those lines down each side of the seam line, and it really did help in lining up the green strip perfectly. And pins turned out to be just fine to keep it in place. After all that thread debating, I almost threaded my machine with the wrong green. So then just needed to top stitch down both sides of the green strip to apply it to the bodice. So I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is I think this looks pretty good. The bad news is it could look better because the seams are slightly puckered. Now the deal is this is a very tightly woven thin fabric, and I noticed when I was testing things out in the beginning that the fabric had a tendency to pucker. So I did some reading about that, and I changed to a microtex needle, which I was going to anyway, and I loosened the tension in my machine and it seemed pretty good, except when I got to these long seams, it kind of piled up on me. Now steaming did help a great deal. But I think this is one of the reasons why I don't like sewing with solids, because you can just see every little sin. So I think what I'm going to do about this is I'm going to ignore it because I can't do anything about it now. So it is what it is. I think it's still going to be cute. You know, it's a wash and wear shirt. It'll get lived in looking after I'm wearing it and gets wrinkled and all that stuff anyway. So I'm just going to keep on plowing ahead, or I am never going to finish this project. I did make one important decision for the front, which is I'm using pink for the facing. And the reason I'm using pink is obviously it would make a little bit more sense to use orange, but when I compare both of them under the pink, you could really see the orange more. So I'm going to go with pink. And then I have to decide now, what am I doing for the back? Am I going to do all solid like the pattern, or am I up for doing this again? I don't know that I'm up for doing this again. So I'm inclined to go with solid. The pattern used orange for the solid. I did determine that I had enough that didn't have little marks all over the fabric to use the orange. I could use the pink though. It's pretty fun. I don't know. I'm going to sit and think about that for a minute. One informal polling of my spouse later, and I went with orange like the original pattern for the back. Okay, everybody, do I have one more thing to overthink? I absolutely do, because it is facing time. Now, I cut out the pink for the front, and I was debating about the back, which I have now cut, and I realized when I placed this under here, it is so obvious, and theoretically, I know that you can have a facing under a sheer garment. I think this is also why I don't sew that many sheer garments, because I have been in this position before where I've just thought about this and thought about this and thought about this. Now, of course, my inclination then would be just do bias tape for the neckline. It's what I'm doing for the armholes. But this is pretty bulky. Now, this is really thin fabric, but I have the folded back seam allowance on the green. I've got the orange and the pink and that seam, and boy, that just feels like you add in 2 layers of bias tape because the seam allowance, and then you fold it over. That feels like an awful lot to turn under and still have look nice. So, I don't know what I'm going to do. Maybe I'll mock this up and do a little sample with some bias tape and see if I can even turn that in and have that look nice. If not, I'm just going to do a facing. You're going to see it, and I am not going to worry about it. And if there's anyone among you who thought, but wait, Tasha, earlier you made a couple of samples. Why don't you just use one of those to test out the bias tape? Good point. And thankfully, I remembered that I did that just before I went to make another one. So this was actually much quicker to figure out than I thought. And I think I'm going to go with bias tape, actually. So this was not too bad. I just trimmed down a little bit of the bulk in the seam allowances, and it was not too difficult to do this. Now, I think that this is actually going to be a nice way to finish the neckline. I mean, the added bonus is I'm already finishing the sleeves with bias tape, It's more annoying doing it this way. It'll take a little bit longer, but then it'll be the same finish for the neckline and for the sleeves. So it'll be a little bit more uniform looking, I guess. Not that I necessarily would have thought about that if this wasn't a sheer fabric, but since it is, I am thinking about that. So I will need to switch thread colors between the orange part and the pink part, but that's okay too. So now I just need to cut off 3/8 of an inch off the front and back necklines since I added that, since I was going to use a facing, but now I'm not. So I need to cut it back off. And then I can finally sew the back to the front. So I sewed the shoulder seams and then made myself some bias tape. I ended up using all orange since it was the dominant color. Did I still obsess over that decision? Yes. I will say at this point in the project, I knew I would hate doing the bias tape, and I was not wrong. It went fine. Attaching it was uneventful. It's just that the hand sewing part was particularly slow and arduous since I had to be really careful with this thin fabric to not have my hand stitches pick up more than one thread of the fashion fabric so it didn't show too much from the right side. And as I was doing it, I was thinking, oh joy, I get to do this 2 more times for the sleeves. Okay, the bias tape around the neckline is finished, and it really was not a problem trimming off a little bit of the bulk to have that strip turned under, and I think that that was a good call. And if you're wondering why I have left the sleeves open and didn't do the side seams yet, because I plan on doing the bias tape flat and then sewing the sleeve and the side seam all together. And I got that idea from this vintage sewing pattern. This is an advanced Sew Easy pattern. I love this wrap dress. I've made a few of these. And this, I think, was the first place I saw the idea where you could just do the bias tape around the armhole flat and then sew the side seam and then fold back the bias tape. And I thought, brilliant, much nicer than doing it when the armhole is in a small tube. So that's what I'm going to do next. So my bias tape is sewed onto my sleeve and I have pressed it away from the body. So all I have to do for this is when I pin the side seam, I just need to fold open the end of the bias tape on both sides and then just sew this side seam like normal, trim it and finish the seam allowances. And then I'll just be able to fold in the bias tape around the armhole and slip stitch that shut, which will mean at that point all I'll have left is the hem. Now I tried the blouse on in the middle of doing the bias tape only to discover I'd made a huge error when I decreased the cut-on sleeve, and it severely limited my range of motion without a gusset in the underarm. I knew better and I forgot, and I did it anyway. And while I'd read one more tip for puckered seams to try, which is reduce the stitch length, it didn't help for the side seams. So I was steamed at this point, and I could barely convince myself to even finish the sleeve bias tape and hem this. I was pretty well convinced that this was going to look terrible in the end. But I tried it on when it was all done, and in spite of everything, I kind of liked it. So where am I with this? I nailed recreating the vintage McCalls pattern look, and the color blocking was a big win. I'm really happy with how that looks. So even with the slight puckering and the tighter sleeve and shoulder that I did to myself, I would definitely still wear this. Even if I did feel like throwing it in the trash while I was working on it. And you know what? I may come back to this idea because I want to try it in jersey fabric too. I'm going to think about those plans, and in the meantime, you can watch one of these 2 videos, and I'll see you again soon with more vintage sewing.